I spent Thanksgiving night alone in a hospital bed, watching the parking lot empty as families drove home to digest their turkey and count their blessings, while my own family counted me out completely. When I finally realized they weren't coming back, I made a phone call that would strip away everything they thought they were entitled to. What happened next will make you reconsider everything you believe about unconditional love, because sometimes the people who owe you the most are the ones who give you the least. My name is Judith Ronan, and I'm 78 years old. I've lived in Salem, Oregon my entire life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the same modest two-story house where I raised 5 children after my husband Everett died in a logging accident, when I was just 42. That was 30. When my youngest daughter Mabel went through her messy divorce and needed a place to stay with her 3 children for 8 months, I converted my sewing room into a bedroom and pretended I didn't mind the chaos. I was the one who hosted every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every birthday party. For 36 years, my house was the center of our family universe. I cooked for 12 people every holiday, decorated my home like a magazine spread, and somehow managed to buy meaningful presents for 5 children, 4 sons and daughters-in-law, and 11 grandchildren, all while living on a widow's pension and the modest income from the small cleaning business I ran until I was 72. My children always marveled at how I managed it all. "Mom, you're amazing," they'd say. "We don't know how you do it." But they never asked how I actually afforded it all. Never wondered why I drove the same 15-year-old Honda while contributing to their children's college funds. They just accepted my generosity as their due, the way children accept that the sun will rise every morning. Samantha, now 54, became the most successful of my children. She owns a thriving real estate agency in downtown Salem and lives in a beautiful colonial house in the West Hills with her husband Keith Prentice, a prominent attorney. Their twin boys, now 28, both graduated from expensive private colleges that I helped finance. Douglas, 52, never quite found his footing after his father died, but he manages an auto repair shop and has been sober for 3 years now. His wife Guinevere is a nurse, and they have 2 teenage daughters who barely acknowledge my existence. My middle son, Ansel, moved to Portland 15 years ago to work in tech. At 49, he's financially successful but emotionally distant, calling only on major holidays and visiting maybe twice a year. He's married to a woman who's never warmed to me, and their son is a stranger to me, despite being my grandson. Then there's Mabel, my baby at 45, who never fully recovered from her divorce 5 years ago. She works as a teacher's aide and struggles to make ends meet with her 3 children. I've been her safety net through every crisis, every financial emergency, every emotional breakdown. Her ex-husband pays sporadic child support, so I've filled the gaps more times than I can count. My oldest son, Keith Sykes, yes, we gave him the same first name as Samantha's husband, which has caused decades of confusion at family gatherings, is 56 and lives just 20 minutes away. He works as a contractor and has always been the most reliable of my children, or so I thought. He's married to a woman who tolerates me, but has never made an effort to include me in their lives beyond obligatory holiday visits. For all these years, I told myself I was blessed to have such a large, close-knit family. I convinced myself that their constant need for my help was proof of how much they loved and valued me. I was proud of being the grandmother who could solve every problem, heal every hurt, and bring everyone together around my dining room table. But pride, I've learned, can make you blind to some very uncomfortable truths. It started with dizziness on November 21st. I was in my kitchen, preparing the turkey brine for Thanksgiving dinner, a tradition I'd maintained for over 30 years, when the room began to spin violently. I reached for the counter to steady myself, but my legs buckled, and I collapsed onto the ceramic tile floor with a crack that I felt in my bones. Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor for the past 22 years, found me 4 hours later when she came to drop off the cranberry sauce recipe I'd requested. She called 911, and I spent the next hour in an ambulance, then the emergency room, then finally a hospital bed, where a young doctor with kind eyes told me I'd suffered a minor stroke. Minor felt like an inadequate word for the terror that gripped me as I lay in that sterile room, connected to machines that beeped and hummed, and reminded me with every sound that my body had betrayed me. At 78, I'd been remarkably healthy, still living independently, still driving, still managing my own affairs. The stroke felt like a preview of my mortality that I wasn't ready to watch. The doctor explained that I'd need to stay for observation over the holiday weekend. "We want to monitor you closely," she said, "and run some additional tests to make sure this doesn't happen again." The hospital would be my home for Thanksgiving, the first time in 36 years that I wouldn't be hosting dinner for my family. I called Samantha first, my hands shaking as I held the phone. She'd always been my most responsible child, the one who took charge in family crises. When she answered, I could hear the chaos of pre-holiday preparation in the background, children laughing, pots clattering, the general mayhem that comes with hosting a family gathering. "Mom," she said, sounding distracted. "What's up?" "I'm right in the middle of getting everything ready for tomorrow." The irony wasn't lost on me. She was getting ready for a Thanksgiving dinner that for the first time in over 3 decades, I wouldn't be cooking. "Samantha, I'm in the hospital," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my hands were trembling. "I had a stroke this morning." The line went quiet for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then I heard her voice, sharp with concern. "A stroke? Mom, are you okay? Which hospital?" When I told her I was at Salem General, she immediately said, "I'll be right there." But then I heard Keith's voice in the background, something about the turkey timer and guests arriving early, and her tone shifted slightly. "Actually, let me just finish getting the turkey in the oven, and then I'll head over. Will you be okay for another hour or two?" I wanted to tell her that I was scared, that I'd been lying on my kitchen floor for 4 hours, thinking I might die there alone, that I needed to see a familiar face more than I'd ever needed anything in my life. Instead, I said, "Of course, honey, take care of what you need to do." But she didn't come in an hour, or 2. When I called her cell phone at 6 that evening, it went straight to voicemail. I left a message, trying to sound casual. "Hi Samantha, just checking in. Hope the dinner preparations are going well. Call me when you get a chance." She texted back an hour later. "So sorry, Mom. House full of people. Keith's partners and their families came early. We'll try to get there later tonight." Later never came. I tried Douglas next, but his phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. When he finally called back the next morning, Thanksgiving Day, he sounded hungover and distracted. "Mom, Guinevere told me you called. What's going on?" I explained about the stroke, about being in the hospital, and I could hear him processing the information slowly, the way he'd always done since he was a child. "Shit, Mom. I mean, sorry, that's scary. Are you okay? Do you need anything?" What I needed was for one of my children to care enough to visit me when I was frightened and alone. What I said was, "I'm fine, honey. The doctors are taking good care of me." "Good, good, that's good. Listen, we're supposed to go to Guinevere's sister's place for dinner today, and you know how she gets when we change plans. But maybe I can swing by tomorrow or this weekend?" Guinevere's sister, whom I'd met exactly twice in the 15 years Douglas had been married to her. Thanksgiving dinner with near strangers was more important than visiting his mother in the hospital. "That's fine, Douglas. Enjoy your dinner." Mabel was my next call, and I had the most hope for her response. After all, I'd been her lifeline through every crisis, every financial emergency, every moment when she needed someone to watch her children or listen to her problems. Surely she would understand what it meant to need someone. "Mom," she said, when she answered, and I could hear genuine concern in her voice. "I was just thinking about you. It feels so weird not coming to your house for Thanksgiving. The kids keep asking when we're going to Grandma's." "Well, there's been a change of plans, sweetheart. I'm actually in the hospital. I had a stroke yesterday morning." The gasp was immediate and real. "Oh my God, Mom, are you okay? Is it serious?" I explained the situation, and she was appropriately horrified and concerned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But then came the inevitable complication. "Mom, I want to come see you right now, but I promised the kids we'd go to that new indoor trampoline place today, since we weren't having our usual dinner. They've been looking forward to it for weeks, and I already paid for the passes. And then my friend Jessica invited us to her family's dinner, and I said yes because I thought we'd be free. The children she'd been raising with my constant help, both financial and emotional, were more excited about jumping on trampolines than seeing their grandmother in the hospital. I understand, Mabel. You should keep your plans, but I'll definitely come tomorrow, I promise. First thing in the morning. Tomorrow's promise from Mabel was about as reliable as a weather forecast, and I'd learned that lesson the hard way over the years. Keith, my oldest son, not my son-in-law, was my last local hope. He answered on the first ring, which felt promising. Mom, happy Thanksgiving. How are you doing? I'd been practicing this conversation in my head, trying to find the right words to convey the seriousness without sounding dramatic. Keith, I'm actually calling from Salem General. I had a stroke yesterday, and they're keeping me for observation over the weekend. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was appropriately serious. Jesus, Mom, that's terrible. Are you okay? Do you need me to bring you anything? For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. Finally, one of my children was responding the way I'd hoped they all would. I'm okay, honey, just scared. You know, it would mean a lot if you could visit. Of course. Well, today's going to be tough, because we're hosting Linda's whole family. Her parents drove down from Seattle, and her brother flew in from Denver. It's the first time we've all been together in 3 years, but I can probably get away for a quick visit tomorrow afternoon. Linda's family, whom he saw every few years, took precedence over his mother who'd raised him alone after his father died. The pattern was becoming clear, but I wasn't ready to accept what it meant. These were my children, the babies I'd nursed through illnesses, the toddlers I'd chased around this very hospital when they'd needed stitches or broken bone repairs. These were the teenagers I'd waited up for, worried sick when they missed curfew. These were the young adults I'd bailed out of trouble, both literally and figuratively, more times than I could count. Surely they were just caught up in holiday obligations. Surely they'd realize that their mother needed them, and find a way to visit. Surely 36 years of unwavering devotion counted for something. I spent Thanksgiving Day watching the Macy's parade on the small television mounted to the wall, eating turkey from a cafeteria tray, and waiting for someone who shared my blood to remember that I existed. The hospital staff tried their best to make Thanksgiving special for the patients who couldn't be home. The nurses wore turkey-shaped pins, and someone had hung paper leaves along the corridors in shades of orange and gold. A volunteer came around with small pumpkin pies in plastic containers, and the chaplain stopped by each room to ask if anyone wanted to talk or pray together. Do you have family coming to visit today?
Asked Nancy, the day nurse who'd been taking care of me since I arrived.
She was probably in her 50s, with graying hair, and the kind of gentle efficiency that comes from years of dealing with frightened patients. Maybe later, I said, though by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I was beginning to doubt my own words. They're all busy with their own celebrations. Nancy nodded with the practiced understanding of someone who'd seen this scenario play out countless times. The holidays can be complicated for families, she said, diplomatically, but you focus on getting better, that's what matters most. I tried to focus on getting better, but it's hard to heal when your heart is breaking in ways that have nothing to do with medical conditions. I kept checking my phone, hoping for calls or texts that didn't come. I stared out the window at the parking lot, watching families arrive to visit other patients, carrying flowers and balloons, and the kind of concerned expressions I'd been hoping to see on my own children's faces. Around 3 o'clock, my phone finally rang. Ansel's name appeared on the screen, and I answered eagerly, grateful that at least one of my children had remembered me on Thanksgiving. "Hey, Mom," he said, and I could hear voices and laughter in the background. "Happy Thanksgiving. How's everything going?" He didn't know. None of them had talked to each other, which meant none of them had shared the news about my stroke. They were all living their separate lives, celebrating their separate holidays, and none of them had thought to check in with the woman who'd been the center of their family for 36 years. "Actually, Ansel, I'm in the hospital. I had a stroke yesterday morning." The background noise continued for a moment before I heard him say, "Hold on, let me go somewhere quieter." Then there was silence, followed by his voice, suddenly serious and focused. "Mom, what happened? Are you okay?" I explained the situation again, and unlike his siblings, Ansel seemed to grasp the seriousness immediately. "I should drive down there. This is serious." "You don't have to do that, honey. Portland's 2 hours away, and you have company. Company can wait. You're my mother. Let me talk to Sarah and see if we can get on the road tonight. For the first time since I'd collapsed in my kitchen, I felt like someone understood that this was important, that I was important. But then I heard a woman's voice in the background, Sarah, his wife, and I could make out enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. She wants you to drive to Salem tonight? On Thanksgiving? We have 16 people here, including your boss and his wife. You can't just leave in the middle of dinner. The conversation continued in muffled tones, and when Ansel came back to the phone, his voice had changed. Mom, I'm really sorry, but tonight's not going to work. We've got a house full of people, including some important clients, and I can't really leave. But I'll drive down first thing tomorrow morning, okay? I'll spend the whole day with you. Another tomorrow promise, another priority that ranked higher than their mother in the hospital. That's fine, Ansel. Take care of your guests. Are you sure you're okay? Do you need me to call the others? No, honey, I've already talked to them. They'll visit when they can. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my hospital room and tried to process what was happening. 5 children, all adults, all living within driving distance except for Ansel, and not one of them had found a way to spend even an hour with me on the day I'd had a stroke. Not one of them had rearranged their plans or made me a priority, or shown up the way I'd shown up for them countless times over the years. I thought about all the times I'd dropped everything when they needed me. When Samantha had her emergency C-section with the twins, I'd been in her hospital room before Keith had even arrived, staying for 3 days to help with the babies. When Douglas had his accident at work and needed surgery on his back, I'd driven to the hospital in a snowstorm and slept in the waiting room chair for 2 nights. When Mabel's youngest daughter had pneumonia last year, I'd taken a week off from my part-time job to help with childcare, so Mabel wouldn't have to miss work. Every crisis, every emergency, every moment when they needed support, I'd been there. Not tomorrow, not when it was convenient, not after I finished my own plans. Immediately, because that's what love looked like to me, that's what family meant. But apparently I'd been operating under a different definition of family than my children had learned. As the afternoon turned to evening, I watched the Thanksgiving parade replays and tried to convince myself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, when their holiday obligations were fulfilled, they'd remember that their mother was lying in a hospital bed, scared and alone. Tomorrow, they'd show up with flowers and apologies and explanations for why today had been impossible. But deep down, in a place I wasn't ready to acknowledge yet, I was beginning to suspect that tomorrow would bring more excuses, more conflicts, more reasons why visiting their mother wasn't quite important enough to prioritize. The truth was knocking at the door of my consciousness, but I wasn't ready to let it in. Not yet. I still believed in the family I thought I'd raised, the children I thought I'd loved into being loving adults themselves. I had no idea how wrong I was about to discover I'd been. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Pacific Northwest weather that makes everything feel heavy and sad. I woke up hoping that yesterday had been an aberration, that my children would start trickling in throughout the day with sheepish apologies and genuine concern. Samantha called first, around 9 in the morning, her voice bright with the artificial cheer of someone trying to compensate for guilt. Mom, good morning, how are you feeling today? Better, I think. The dizziness has mostly stopped. That's wonderful news. I'm so sorry about yesterday. It was absolutely insane here. Keith's law partners and their families, plus his parents drove down from Bend, and you know how his mother gets when things aren't perfect. I barely had time to breathe. Keith's mother, who'd made it clear for 26 years that she thought Samantha had married beneath her station. The same woman who'd once told me at a family gathering that she couldn't understand why I'd let myself go after my husband died, as if raising 5 children alone while working multiple jobs should have left me time for spa treatments. I understand, honey. You had a house full of people. Exactly. But today's much calmer. The boys went back to Portland this morning, and Keith's parents are leaving after lunch. I was thinking I could stop by around 3 or 4. Around 3 or 4. Not I'll be there as soon as I can get away, or I'm leaving right now. A vague window of time that could easily shift if something more interesting came up. That would be nice, Samantha. Perfect. Oh, and Mom, I hope you don't mind, but I invited Douglas and his family over for leftover turkey today. You know how Guinevere gets about cooking, and the girls are always happier when they have their cousins to play with. So if I'm a little later than expected, that's why.
Of course.
The family gathering would continue without me, and my visit would be squeezed in around the edges of more important activities. But 3 o'clock came and went. So did 4. At 5:30, Samantha texted, "Running late. Douglas brought more people than expected. We'll try for tonight or tomorrow morning." Tomorrow morning became tomorrow afternoon became maybe later this weekend. By Sunday I realized Samantha wasn't coming at all. Douglas's pattern was different, but equally disappointing. He called every day with elaborate explanations for why he couldn't visit. Friday it was a work emergency. Someone had flooded their garage and needed immediate help with their car. Saturday, it was Guinevere's birthday celebration that had been planned for months. Sunday it was the girls' soccer tournament that they couldn't miss. Mom, you understand, right? These tournaments are really important for college scholarships, and we already paid the registration fees. I understood that his teenage daughter's weekend soccer games ranked higher than visiting his mother, who'd just had a stroke. Mabel's excuses were the most creative, perhaps because she'd had the most practice making them over the years. She was supposed to come Friday morning, but called at 8 a.m. to explain that her youngest had woken up with a fever. I can't bring him to the hospital obviously, and I can't leave him alone when he's sick. Saturday, the middle child had a friend's birthday party that Mabel had forgotten about. I already RSVP'd and bought a gift, and you know how kids are about missing parties. It would break her heart. Sunday brought news of a plumbing emergency. The bathroom pipe burst and there's water everywhere. I have to wait for the emergency plumber, and you know how long those calls can take. Each excuse was perfectly reasonable on its own. Children do get sick. Birthday parties are important to kids. Plumbing emergencies require immediate attention. But taken together, they painted a picture of someone who was very good at finding reasons not to do something she didn't want to do. Keith, my oldest son, was the most straightforward in his avoidance. He simply didn't call at all on Friday. When I finally called him Saturday afternoon, he sounded surprised to hear from me. "Oh, Mom, hi, how are you feeling?" "I'm still in the hospital, Keith. The doctors want to keep me through the weekend for observation." Right. That's probably smart. Better safe than sorry. There was a pause, and I could hear the television in the background. "Listen, this weekend has been crazy. Linda's parents extended their stay, and we've been playing tour guide around Salem. You know how it is when you have out-of-town guests." I did know how it was. I'd hosted out-of-town guests more times than I could count, including his in-laws on multiple occasions. The difference was that I'd never used those visits as an excuse to avoid someone who needed me. "When do you think you might be able to stop by?" "Well, they're leaving Tuesday morning, so maybe Tuesday afternoon, or Wednesday might be better, actually. I've got to catch up on work after taking the weekend off." Tuesday became Wednesday, became later this week sometime. By the following Monday, when I was finally discharged from the hospital, Keith still hadn't found an hour to visit his mother. Ansel, my one hope for a different response, called Sunday evening, with news that made my heart sink completely. "Mom, I feel terrible about this, but I'm not going to be able to drive down this weekend. Sarah's brother flew in from Boston unexpectedly, some kind of work crisis, and we're the only family he has on the West Coast. Sarah would kill me if I left while he's here." Sarah's brother, whom I'd met once at their wedding 7 years ago, a virtual stranger, took priority over his mother in the hospital. "Plus," Ansel continued, "I've been thinking about it, and maybe it's better if I wait until you're feeling completely better before I visit. You probably need rest more than company right now, right?" It was the most sophisticated excuse yet, framing his absence as consideration for my well-being, rather than his own convenience. As I lay in my hospital bed Sunday night, preparing for what would be my final night there, I began to see the pattern clearly. 5 children, 5 sets of excuses, 5 different ways of saying the same thing. You're not important enough to inconvenience ourselves for. The woman who'd raised them alone, who'd sacrificed her own comfort and dreams to ensure their success, who'd been available for every crisis and celebration for 36 years, wasn't worth a single hour of their holiday weekend. That's when I began to understand that I'd been living a lie for decades. Monday morning brought my discharge papers and a conversation that would change everything forever. Dr. Patricia Mills, the neurologist who'd been overseeing my care, sat down beside my bed with the kind of gentle expression that usually precedes difficult news. "Mrs. Ronan, your test results look good. The stroke was minor, and with proper medication and lifestyle adjustments, there's no reason you can't continue living independently. However, I do want to discuss your support system at home." My support system: family, friends, neighbors who can check on you regularly. Recovery from any medical event is easier when patients have strong social connections. "I noticed you haven't had many visitors during your stay." The observation hit like a physical blow. Even a stranger, a doctor who'd known me for 4 days, had noticed that no one cared enough to visit me. "My children have been busy with holiday obligations," I said automatically, the excuse I'd been making for them feeling hollow in my own mouth. Dr. Mills nodded diplomatically. "The holidays can be challenging for families, but moving forward, it would be beneficial to have regular contact with family members who can monitor your well-being." After she left, I sat alone in my room, waiting for the discharge nurse to bring my medications and final instructions. My suitcase was packed with the few items Mabel had grudgingly brought me on Saturday: pajamas that were too small and a toothbrush I didn't need because the hospital provided them. Even that simple act of bringing me necessities had been done with obvious reluctance and multiple sighs about how busy her day was. That's when my phone rang with a call that would shatter every illusion I'd been clinging to. "Mrs. Ronan, this is Jessica Martinez. I'm Mabel's friend." I recognized the name immediately. Jessica was the woman whose family Thanksgiving dinner Mabel had attended instead of visiting me in the hospital. "Oh, hello, Jessica. How are you?" "I'm fine, thank you. Listen, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to reach out about something that's been bothering me since Thursday." My heart began to race. "What do you mean?" "Well, Mabel mentioned that you were in the hospital, and I feel terrible about this, but I think there's been some miscommunication." "Miscommunication?" Jessica's voice was careful, as if she was trying to navigate delicate territory. "When Mabel told me you'd had a stroke and were in the hospital, I immediately told her she should go see you. I even offered to watch her kids so she could visit. But she said the whole family had decided to give you space to recover, that you'd specifically asked not to have visitors until you were feeling better." The words hit me like a second stroke. "She said what?" "She said you were overwhelmed by the hospital environment and needed quiet time to heal. She made it sound like visiting you would actually be harmful to your recovery." I believed her, but something about it didn't sit right with me, especially when she seemed so relaxed about the whole thing. I was quiet for so long that Jessica asked if I was still there. "I'm here," I managed. "Jessica, I never asked them not to visit. I've been hoping and waiting for someone to come see me since Thursday." The silence on the other end was deafening. When Jessica spoke again, her voice was filled with horror and anger. "Oh my God, Mrs. Ronan, I'm so sorry. If I had known, I would have driven you there myself." I can't believe she lied about something like that. After I hung up, I sat staring at the wall where someone had hung a cheerful poster about the importance of family support during recovery. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Mabel hadn't just failed to visit me, she'd actively created a story to justify her absence and make herself look considerate, rather than selfish. She'd told her friend that I'd asked for space, painting herself as the dutiful daughter respecting her mother's wishes, rather than the neglectful child avoiding an inconvenient obligation. But if Mabel had lied to Jessica, what had the others told their friends, their spouses, their colleagues? How many people had heard carefully crafted versions of events that made my children look like caring family members who were simply respecting my need for solitude? I realized that not only had they abandoned me in my moment of need, but they'd also constructed narratives to protect their own reputations while doing it. They'd found a way to neglect their mother and feel good about themselves at the same time. The truth crashed over me with devastating clarity. I wasn't dealing with children who were simply too busy or overwhelmed to visit. I was dealing with adults who felt so little genuine concern for my well-being that they could lie about it to make themselves look better. 36 years of motherhood, and I'd raised 5 people who could abandon me in a hospital and sleep soundly at night by telling themselves and others that they were actually being considerate. The transformation began in that moment, sitting in my hospital bed with discharge papers in one hand and my phone in the other. The hurt was still there, but underneath it, something harder and more powerful was growing: anger. Pure righteous anger at being taken for granted, lied about, and dismissed by the people I'd loved most in the world. For the first time in my adult life, I was about to put myself first. The ride home from the hospital in Mrs. Henderson's station wagon was silent except for the gentle hum of the heater and the occasional comment about how the neighborhood had changed while I was away. 4 days felt like 4 months when you're discovering that your entire family structure was built on quicksand. "You sure you don't want me to stay for a while?" Mrs. Henderson asked as she helped me carry my small bag to the front door. "I could make you some soup, tidy up a bit." I almost said yes, desperate for any human companionship that felt genuine. But I needed to be alone to process what I'd learned, to figure out who Judith Ronan was when she wasn't bending over backward to accommodate everyone else's needs. "Thank you, Eleanor, but I think I need some time to myself." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength for an 82-year-old woman. "You call me if you need anything, here, day or night." Some of us still understand what it means to be neighborly. After she left, I stood in my living room and looked around at the evidence of 36 years of single-minded devotion to my children. Photos covered every surface: school pictures, graduation photos, wedding albums, pictures of grandchildren I barely knew despite buying them Christmas presents every year. The mantle held trophies my children had won in high school, achievements I'd celebrated as if they were my own. But what did I have to show for my own life? What had Judith Ronan accomplished beyond raising 5 ungrateful adults? I walked to my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser, pulling out a manila folder I hadn't looked at in years. Inside were documents I'd accumulated, but never really considered as sources of power. Bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, insurance policies. After Everett died, his life insurance payout and the settlement from the logging company had left me with more money than I'd ever imagined having. Instead of living off it, I'd been fiercely protective of that money, investing it carefully while living on my cleaning business income, and later my small pension. I'd wanted to leave something substantial to my children, a legacy that would honor their father's memory and my sacrifice. But I'd never told them about the full extent of what I'd built. They knew I owned my house outright. The mortgage had been paid off years ago. They knew I was comfortable, but not wealthy. What they didn't know was exactly how comfortable I'd become through 36 years of careful financial management. I spread the most recent statements across my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped my children with homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays and planned family vacations I couldn't afford, but somehow managed to provide anyway. The numbers told a story I'd almost forgotten about myself. My house, purchased for $35,000 in 1987, was now worth $485,000, according to the latest property tax assessment. The neighborhood had gentrified around me, and my modest 2-story had become prime real estate. My investment portfolio, built through decades of putting away $200, $300 every month regardless of how tight money was, had grown to $340,000. I'd reinvested dividends, made conservative choices, and watched compound interest work its slow magic while my children assumed I was just scraping by. The life insurance policy I'd maintained faithfully, even during the leanest years, would pay out $150,000. My pension, when calculated as a lump sum for inheritance purposes, was worth another $85,000. And then there was the business. My cleaning service had been more successful than I'd ever let on. I'd sold it when I turned 72, but I'd kept the commercial accounts for 2 office buildings downtown. The rental income from those contracts brought in $2,800 every month, money I'd been quietly adding to my investments because I didn't need it for living expenses. Altogether, I was looking at an estate worth nearly $1.1 million. Over $1 million that 5 adults had assumed would be theirs someday, simply by virtue of being born to me. Money that represented every sacrifice I'd made, every luxury I'd foregone, every time I'd chosen their needs over my own comfort. I thought about Douglas, who'd been too busy with work emergencies to visit me, constantly complaining about his mortgage payments and his daughter's college expenses. I thought about Mabel, who'd lied to her friend rather than admit she'd abandoned her mother, always calling me when she needed money for car repairs or school clothes for her kids. I thought about Samantha in her expensive house with her successful husband, who'd been too concerned about impressing Keith's law partners to spend an hour with her mother in the hospital. I thought about my oldest son Keith, who'd prioritized entertaining his in-laws over visiting the woman who'd raised him alone after his father died. And I thought about Ansel, 2 hours away in Portland, who'd framed his absence as consideration for my well-being, rather than admit his wife's brother mattered more than his mother. None of them had asked if I needed anything during my hospital stay. None of them had inquired about my finances, my insurance, whether I could afford the medical bills. They'd simply assumed I'd handle everything myself, the way I always had. They were right about one thing: I would handle everything myself. But not in the way they expected. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Harold Brennan, the attorney who'd handled Everett's estate, and had been my lawyer for various small matters over the years. It was Monday evening, but Harold had always told his clients to call him directly if they needed urgent legal advice. "Harold, this is Judith Ronan. I need to schedule an appointment as soon as possible. I want to discuss making some significant changes to my will." Harold Brennan arrived at my house Tuesday morning with his worn leather briefcase and the same kind smile that had helped me navigate the worst period of my life 36 years earlier. He was in his late 70s now, his hair completely white, but his mind was still sharp and his dedication to his clients unwavering. "Judith, you look well considering what you've been through," he said, as I poured coffee in my kitchen. "Eleanor Henderson called me yesterday. She's worried about you." It struck me that my neighbor had shown more concern for my well-being in 4 days than my own children had. Eleanor had called my lawyer to make sure I had proper legal support, something that would never have occurred to Samantha or Douglas or any of the others. "Harold, I need to make some changes to my will. Significant changes." He pulled out a yellow legal pad and set his pen carefully beside it. "Tell me what you have in mind." "I want to remove my children as beneficiaries. All of them. I want my estate to go to charity instead." Harold's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "That's a substantial decision, Judith. Can you tell me what's prompted this change?" I told him everything. The stroke, the hospital stay, the pattern of excuses and absences. I told him about Mabel's lie to her friend, about the family gathering that happened without me, about 5 adult children who couldn't find a single hour over 4 days to visit their mother, who'd raised them alone. When I finished, Harold was quiet for a long moment. "Judith, I have to ask, have you discussed this with any of them? Have you given them a chance to understand how their behavior affected you?" I shouldn't have to explain to adults that their mother matters, Harold. But no, I haven't confronted them directly. I wanted to make sure my legal affairs were in order first. "I understand, but before we proceed with formal changes, I'd recommend having at least one conversation with them. Not because you owe them anything, but because it will strengthen your position legally if anyone challenges this decision later." That afternoon, I decided to start with Samantha. As my eldest daughter, and supposedly the most responsible of my children, she would set the tone for how the others responded to my newfound clarity about our relationship. I called her around 2 o'clock, when I knew she'd be between client appointments. "Mom, how are you feeling? Are you settling back in okay at home?" Her voice was bright and cheerful, with no trace of guilt or awareness that anything was wrong with her behavior. "I'm fine, Samantha. I'm calling because I wanted to talk to you about something important." "Of course, what's on your mind?" "I wanted to understand why you didn't visit me in the hospital." There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted to defensive. "Mom," I explained all that. "It was Thanksgiving weekend, we had a house full of people, and you know how crazy the holidays are." "Yes, you explained it, but I'm trying to understand the thinking behind it. Help me understand how hosting a dinner party was more important than visiting your mother, who just had a stroke. That's not fair, Mom. It wasn't just a dinner party. Keith's partners were there with their families, and you know how important those relationships are for his career. And his parents drove down from Bend specifically to see us. Samantha, I'm 78 years old. I had a stroke. I was alone and scared in a hospital bed. And you chose Keith's career networking over spending 1 hour with me. The silence stretched between us, and I could practically hear her processing this direct confrontation. In 36 years of motherhood, I'd never spoken to any of my children this bluntly about their behavior. Mom, I don't know what you want me to say. I'm sorry you're upset, but I had responsibilities. I can't just drop everything every time something happens. Every time something happens, Samantha, when was the last time I needed you for anything? When was the last time I asked any of you to drop everything for me? Another pause. You're always so independent. You handle everything yourself. I handle everything myself, because none of you have ever offered to help. I've been taking care of everyone else's emergencies for 36 years, but when I have one, you're all too busy. Mom, that's not true. We all care about you, we're just busy with our own lives. Busy with your own lives. Yes, I'm beginning to understand that very clearly. When Samantha spoke again, her voice had an edge of irritation. I don't understand why you're being so dramatic about this. You're fine now, right? The doctors said you're going to be okay. So what's the big deal? The big deal. 4 days of abandonment, lies told to friends, and a complete dismissal of my emotional needs was being characterized as no big deal. The big deal, Samantha, is that I've learned something important about how my children view me. I've learned that I'm not actually a priority in any of your lives. That's ridiculous, Mom. Of course you're a priority. Really? Then why didn't you prioritize me when I needed you most? Because I had other obligations. That doesn't mean you're not important to me. It means exactly that, Samantha. When push comes to shove, when you have to choose between my needs and your convenience, you choose convenience every time. I could hear her getting more agitated. Mom, I don't know what you want from me. I said I'm sorry. What else can I do? Nothing, Samantha. There's nothing you can do. I'm just making sure I understand the situation clearly. What situation? What are you talking about? I'm talking about learning to see things as they really are, instead of as I wished they were. I'm talking about accepting that my children are exactly who they've shown me they are. The conversation ended with Samantha promising to talk about this more when you're feeling better, as if my clarity was a symptom that would pass with time. But I wasn't confused or sick. For the first time in years, I was seeing everything with perfect clarity, and I didn't like what I saw. Wednesday morning brought Harold back to my house with a briefcase full of legal documents, and a somber expression that told me he'd taken our conversation seriously. We sat at my dining room table, the same table where I'd hosted 36 years of family celebrations, and spread out the papers that would redefine my legacy. I've drafted several versions of your new will, Harold said, adjusting his reading glasses. The first completely eliminates your children as beneficiaries. The second leaves each a token amount, say $5,000, which makes it clear the omission was intentional. The third gives them a final opportunity to prove they've changed. What do you mean by the third option? We could include provisions that require them to demonstrate genuine care for your well-being over a specific period, regular visits, assistance with your needs, meaningful involvement in your life. If they meet those requirements, they could inherit. If not, everything goes to charity. I considered this briefly, imagining my children suddenly becoming attentive and caring, knowing their inheritance depended on it. The thought made me feel sick. Harold, I don't want their performance love. I don't want them visiting me because they're afraid of losing money. I want the first option, complete removal. He nodded and pulled out the appropriate documents. Let's discuss the charities then. You mentioned several organizations during our phone call. I had indeed given this considerable thought during my sleepless Monday night. 50% to St. Vincent de Paul, They run the homeless shelter where I've volunteered for 15 years. 25% to the Children's Cancer Research Fund at Salem Hospital, and 25% to establish a scholarship fund at Chemichetta Community College for women over 40 returning to school. Harold made notes on his legal pad. These are excellent choices, Judith. Organizations that do meaningful work in the community. Can you tell me why you selected these particular charities? Because they understand what it means to care for people who can't necessarily give anything back. They help people because those people need help, not because they expect something in return. As Harold prepared the final documents, I walked through my house one more time, looking at the photographs and mementos that told the story of my life as a mother. In every picture, I could remember the sacrifice I'd made to be present for that moment, the overtime shifts worked to afford school clothes, the vacation days used to attend sporting events, the evenings spent helping with homework instead of pursuing my own interests. But scattered among the family photos were other images I'd almost forgotten about. Pictures of me volunteering at the shelter, receiving recognition for my community service, standing with other women at my book club, evidence of the life I'd built outside of motherhood, the relationships I'd formed with people who valued my time and presence without taking it for granted. Judith, I need to discuss something with you, Harold said, as I returned to the dining room. Your children are likely to contest this will. They'll claim you were mentally incompetent, that you were coerced, that this doesn't represent your true wishes. What do you recommend? First, I want you to undergo a psychological evaluation to document your mental competency. Second, I'd like you to prepare a detailed written statement explaining your reasoning. And third, we should make a video recording of you explaining your decision in your own words. The idea of having to prove my sanity to dispose of my own property annoyed me, but I understood the necessity. Whatever it takes to make sure my wishes are honored. Good. I can arrange for Dr. Margaret Chen to conduct the evaluation. She specializes in competency assessments for estate planning. We can do the video recording today if you're comfortable with that. An hour later, I sat facing Harold's small video camera, looking directly into the lens as I explained the most important decision of my later life. My name is Judith Eleanor Ronan, and I am 78 years old. Today is November 30th, 2023, and I am recording this statement to explain why I have chosen to disinherit my 5 children and leave my entire estate to charitable organizations. I paused, thinking about how to explain 36 years of mounting disappointment in a way that would be clear and rational to any judge who might someday watch this recording. For 36 years, I have been a devoted mother and grandmother. After my husband Everett died in 1987, I raised 5 children alone while working multiple jobs and building a modest but substantial estate through careful saving and investment. I believed that love meant sacrifice, that being a good mother meant always putting my children's needs before my own. I looked directly into the camera, imagining my children watching this someday, seeing the disappointment and determination in my eyes. I was wrong. Love should be mutual, care should be reciprocal. Family relationships should be based on genuine concern and respect, not just biological obligation or financial expectation. I continued for another 10 minutes, documenting the pattern of neglect, the hospital abandonment, the lies and excuses that had finally opened my eyes to the truth about my relationships with my children. When Harold turned off the camera, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had officially declared my independence from 36 years of one-sided love. Now what? I asked. Now we wait and see how they respond when they realize what they've lost, Harold said, packing up his equipment. My guess is we won't have to wait very long. He was right. By Friday afternoon, my phone would be ringing with the kind of desperate attention I'd been craving for years. But by then, it would be far too late. The explosion came on Friday afternoon, exactly as Harold had predicted. I was in my garden, cutting back the last of the season's roses, when 3 cars pulled into my driveway simultaneously. Samantha's white BMW, Douglas's pickup truck, and Keith's sedan arrived like a coordinated military operation. I watched through my kitchen window as they huddled together on my front lawn, clearly having planned this intervention. Samantha was gesticulating wildly, Douglas looked agitated, and Keith kept glancing toward the house with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. panic mixed with barely controlled rage. They'd found out about the will. I let them knock twice before opening the door, standing in the doorway without inviting them in. The November air was cold, but I wasn't going to make this conversation comfortable for any of us. "Hello, children. This is unexpected." Samantha stepped forward first, her face flushed with anger and disbelief. "Mom, we need to talk. Keith told us about some crazy rumor regarding your will." "It's not a rumor, Samantha. I've indeed changed my will." The words hit them like a physical blow. Douglas's face went pale, and Keith took a step backward as if I'd slapped him. "Mom, please tell us this isn't true," Keith said, his voice strained. "Please tell us you haven't actually cut your own children out of your will because you're mad about Thanksgiving." "I'm not mad, Keith. I'm enlightened. There's a difference." Samantha's voice turned sharp and desperate. "This is insane, Mom. You can't disinherit your own family because we couldn't visit you in the hospital one weekend. That's not how families work." "You're absolutely right, Samantha. That's not how families work. Families show up for each other. Families prioritize each other's well-being. Families don't lie to friends about why they're abandoning their mother in a hospital bed." The reference to Mabel's lie hit its mark. Samantha's eyes widened as she realized I knew more than they'd assumed. "How much?" Douglas asked suddenly, his voice hoarse. "How much are we talking about?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about his priorities. Not "how can we fix this?" or "what did we do wrong?" but "how much money are we losing?" "Approximately $1.1 million, I said calmly, watching their faces register the shock. Keith stumbled slightly. "$1 million, Mom. We had no idea you had that kind of money." "Of course you didn't. None of you ever asked about my finances. You just assumed I was scraping by while I quietly invested and saved and built something substantial." "Where's it going?" Samantha demanded. "Who are you giving our inheritance to?" "My inheritance," I corrected. "And it's going to organizations that actually care about helping people. St. Vincent de Paul, the Children's Cancer Research Fund, and a scholarship program for women returning to school." Douglas's face twisted with something ugly. "So you're giving our money to strangers?" "I'm giving my money to people who understand the value of caring for others without expecting anything in return." "We care about you, Mom," Keith said desperately. "We all love you. Do you, Keith? Because love isn't something you declare when your inheritance is threatened. Love is something you show through actions, and your actions over the past 2 weeks have shown me exactly how much I mean to all of you." Samantha's mask of concern finally slipped completely. "This is about money, isn't it? You're punishing us financially because your feelings got hurt." "No, Samantha, this is about respect. This is about finally accepting that I deserve to be treated like I matter. And if the only way to get your attention is to threaten your financial expectations, then that tells me everything I need to know about our relationship." They stood there in my doorway. 3 adults who'd just realized that their lifetime meal ticket was about to disappear. Not one of them asked how I was feeling or whether I was recovering well from my stroke. Even in this moment of crisis, their concern was purely financial. I stepped back and began to close the door.
This conversation is over.
"My decision is final. We'll contest it," Douglas said, his voice shaking with rage. "No court will let you do this." "You're welcome to try," I replied. "I've been very thorough in documenting my mental competency and my reasoning." As I closed the door on their shocked faces, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the satisfaction of finally putting myself first. The legal papers arrived exactly 1 week later, delivered by a courier who looked apologetic as he handed me the thick envelope. "Petition to contest last will and testament" was stamped across the top in official legal typography that was meant to intimidate. I called Harold immediately. "They've hired Morrison, Sterling and Associates," he said, after reviewing the documents. "That's an expensive firm that specializes in will contests. They're not playing around, Judith." The petition painted a picture of me as a confused, bitter elderly woman making irrational decisions due to medication side effects and the emotional trauma of my stroke. They claimed I'd been unduly influenced by my attorney and argued that no mentally competent mother would completely disinherit her children over a minor family disagreement. They're requesting extensive medical records, drug screenings and a court-ordered psychological evaluation," Harold continued. "They want to prove you weren't of sound mind when you executed the new will. What they're really proving is that they'll spend thousands of dollars fighting for money they never earned rather than spend 5 minutes examining their own behavior," I replied. The character assassination began immediately. Douglas submitted a statement claiming I'd become increasingly paranoid and hostile since my stroke. Samantha provided testimony from neighbors who said I'd seemed different and more isolated in recent months. Keith brought in our family doctor, who admitted under oath that stroke patients sometimes experience personality changes. But Harold had been thorough. Dr. Chen's psychological evaluation was comprehensive and unambiguous. The video statement I'd made showed a woman who was articulate, rational, and fully aware of her decisions. Most importantly, Harold had insisted on a second evaluation after the will contest was filed, proving my mental state remained consistent. The turning point came during the depositions. Under oath, my children were forced to detail their exact whereabouts during my hospitalization. The transcripts read like a masterclass in selfishness. When Samantha was asked why she hadn't visited her mother who'd just suffered a stroke, her answer was rambling and defensive. "I had house guests and holiday obligations. My husband's career depends on maintaining relationships with his law partners. I couldn't just abandon my responsibilities for what the doctors said was a minor stroke." Douglas's deposition was even more damaging. When pressed about his claim that he was too busy with work emergencies, he had to admit these emergencies included routine service calls that could have been handled by employees. "But you understand, my reputation depends on personally handling major clients." Keith's testimony about prioritizing his in-laws' visit over his mother in the hospital sounded petty and callous when read back in a courtroom setting. The most devastating moment came when Mabel was forced to address her lie to Jessica Martinez. Under oath, she had to admit she'd fabricated the story about me requesting no visitors to avoid admitting she'd abandoned me. "Did your mother ever ask you not to visit her in the hospital?" Harold asked. "No," Mabel whispered. "So when you told Mrs. Martinez that your mother had requested space to recover, that was false?" "Yes." Judge Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over family court for 15 years, showed little patience for adults who felt entitled to their parents' money. During the final hearing, she delivered a statement that validated everything I'd been feeling. "The evidence clearly shows that Mrs. Ronan was mentally competent when she executed her will. Furthermore, this court finds the petitioner's behavior during their mother's medical emergency to be particularly relevant to understanding her decision. Adult children are not entitled to inherit their parents' property simply by virtue of being children." The will contest was dismissed. My estate would go exactly where I'd intended it to go. As we left the courthouse, Harold squeezed my shoulder. "It's over, Judith. Your wishes will be honored." But the real victory wasn't legal, it was personal. I'd finally stopped apologizing for expecting basic human decency from the people who claimed to love me. The months following the court victory brought a freedom I hadn't experienced since before I became a mother at 22. For the first time in 56 years, I was living entirely for myself, making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what my family needed from me. I started with small changes. I redecorated the living room, removing most of the family photos that had dominated every surface, and replacing them with artwork I'd always admired, but never felt I could afford. I bought a comfortable reading chair, a luxury I'd denied myself for decades, while prioritizing everyone else's needs. My volunteer work at St. Vincent de Paul expanded from 1 day a week to 3. Sister Margaret, who ran the shelter, was delighted to have more of my time and quickly put me in charge of coordinating the evening meal program. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely needed and appreciated. "Judith, I don't know what we'd do without you," she said one evening as we cleaned up after serving dinner to 42 homeless individuals. "You have such a gift for making people feel valued." The irony wasn't lost on me that strangers experiencing homelessness showed more gratitude for my presence than my own children ever had. I also joined the Salem Community Chorale, something I'd wanted to do for 15 years, but couldn't because my evenings were always consumed with babysitting grandchildren or helping with various family crises. My voice was rusty at first, but the joy of singing with a group of people who shared my love of music was intoxicating. At chorale practice, I met Margaret Yamamoto, a retired teacher who'd also lost her husband. and was navigating life as an independent widow. We bonded over coffee after rehearsals, sharing stories about rediscovering ourselves after decades of defining ourselves primarily as wives and mothers. I spent 43 years waiting for my children to call, Margaret told me one afternoon as we sat in a cafe downtown. It took me until I was 75 to realize they'd call when they needed something, not when I needed something. Once I accepted that, everything became so much clearer. The most unexpected development was my relationship with two of my grandchildren, Mabel's youngest daughter Emma and Keith's son, Oliver. Emma, now 16, had apparently been paying attention during the family drama and had drawn her own conclusions about her mother's behavior. She started visiting me on Saturdays, initially claiming she needed help with her chemistry homework. But our tutoring sessions quickly evolved into genuine conversations about her college plans, her frustrations with her mother's constant financial stress, and her observations about family dynamics. "Grandma, I was really mad when Mom didn't visit you in the hospital," she told me one Saturday afternoon. "I kept asking when we were going to see you, and she kept making excuses. It didn't make sense to me." Oliver, Keith's 17-year-old son, began stopping by after his part-time job at the hardware store. Unlike his father, Oliver seemed genuinely interested in my stories about his grandfather and what life had been like when I was raising 5 children alone. "Dad never talks about Grandpa Everett," he said one evening, as we looked through old photo albums. "But you tell stories that make him seem real, like he was actually a person, instead of just someone who died before I was born." These relationships with my grandchildren felt different from the ones I'd had when their parents controlled access to them. Emma and Oliver chose to spend time with me, sought out my company, valued my perspective. They weren't visiting out of obligation or because their parents needed free babysitting. Mabel made a few attempts at reconciliation, calling occasionally with updates about her other children and asking tentative questions about my health. Our conversations were polite but distant, like talking to an acquaintance rather than a daughter. "I know you're still upset about everything," she said during one of these calls. "I just want you to know that I do love you, Mom." "I know you think you do, Mabel," I replied. "But love is more than a feeling. Love is a choice you make every day, and you've consistently chosen to put your comfort above my needs." Samantha, Douglas, and Keith made no attempts at contact after the court case ended. According to Emma, they'd convinced themselves that I'd had a mental breakdown and would eventually come to my senses and restore their inheritance. They were waiting for an apology that would never come. A year and a half after that devastating Thanksgiving in the hospital, I celebrated my 80th birthday surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being. The choral threw me a surprise party at the community center, complete with a cake decorated with musical notes and a program of my favorite songs performed in my honor. Margaret Yamamoto gave a speech that brought tears to my eyes. "Judith has shown all of us what it means to value yourself enough to demand respect from others. She's taught us that it's never too late to put yourself first." Emma and Oliver were there, having driven down from their respective colleges where they were thriving on scholarships I'd secretly helped establish through anonymous donations. Emma was studying pre-med with plans to work in underserved communities, while Oliver was majoring in social work, inspired by stories I'd told him about my volunteer work. "Grandma, you saved my life," Emma told me as we cut the cake together. "Watching you stand up for yourself taught me that I don't have to accept poor treatment from anyone, not even family." The transformation in my daily life was remarkable. My mornings were spent reading, gardening, or working on the memoir I'd started writing about my experiences as a single mother in the 1980s and 90s. My afternoons were dedicated to volunteer work that filled me with purpose. My evenings belonged to choral practice, book club meetings, or simply enjoying the peace of my own company. I discovered that I actually enjoyed being alone, not the desperate loneliness I'd felt when waiting for my children to call, but the contentment that comes from being comfortable with yourself. I could spend hours reading without interruption, could eat dinner at 5 o'clock if I felt like it, could watch old movies without apologizing for my preferences. The financial impact of my decision had been significant for my children, but not devastating. Samantha and Keith were financially secure through their careers. Douglas had finally gotten sober and was building a steady business. Mabel struggled the most, but she'd also learned to manage without constantly relying on me as her financial safety net. My estate, now worth over $1.2 million, thanks to continued smart investments, would indeed go to the charities I'd specified. St. Vincent de Paul would expand their job training program. The Children's Cancer Research Fund would fund 2 new research positions. The scholarship program for women returning to school would help dozens of women build better lives for themselves and their families. But perhaps the most important legacy I was leaving was the lesson I'd finally learned myself. You teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. For 56 years, I'd accepted crumbs of attention and called it love. I'd accepted being taken for granted and called it family loyalty. I'd accepted being everyone's last priority and convinced myself that sacrifice was noble. I'd been wrong about all of it. Real love requires mutual respect. Real family relationships are built on genuine care and consideration, not obligation or guilt. Real sacrifice is meaningful only when it's appreciated and reciprocated. My children had taught me an invaluable lesson, though not the one they'd intended. They'd shown me that blood relationships don't automatically create love, that being a mother doesn't mean accepting whatever treatment your children choose to give you, and that it's never too late to start valuing yourself appropriately. The woman who'd spent Thanksgiving alone in a hospital bed had been weak, desperate, and willing to accept whatever scraps of affection her children offered. The woman I'd become was strong, independent, and surrounded by people who valued her presence rather than tolerated it. I'd learned to love myself enough to walk away from people who didn't appreciate what I had to offer. And in doing so, I'd discovered a richness of life I never knew was possible. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your children is stop enabling their selfishness. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give them is the opportunity to face the consequences of their choices. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself, even when everyone else expects you to choose them. My family had left me at the hospital on Thanksgiving, assuming I'd always be there no matter how they treated me. By the time they realized their mistake, I'd already left them, at the mercy of my attorney, and more importantly, at the mercy of their own choices. The woman who'd raised them had finally learned to raise her own standards instead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.